You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. The devastation in Gaza caused by Israel's onslaught of the besieged strip has seen tens of thousands killed, many more injured, and millions displaced. Any figure I give you will be quickly out of date, but the damage to the Palestinian territory is immense. While much of the narrative for the present war begins on the 7th of October with Hamas's brutal assault, the conflict did not begin on that grim Saturday morning. Gaza has been under Israeli siege since 2007, and at least 5 wars have been fought. However, even this outline does not contain the beginning of the Israeli occupation of Palestine, which can be traced back to 1948. It is at times like this we must turn to the guidance of history to get a better understanding about what is unfolding before us. Helping us on this quest is Rashid Khalidi. Rashid Khalidi is an Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University. He's received a BA from Yale University in the 1970s and a D.Phil from Oxford University in 1974, and has taught at the Lebanese University, the American University of Beirut, and the University of Chicago. He was president of the Middle East Studies Association and co-editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies. He served as an advisor to the Palestinian delegation to Madrid and Washington Arab-Israeli peace negotiations from October 1991 until June 1993. Khalidi is the author of 8 books, including the bestseller 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance 1917 to 2017, released in 2020, and Palestinian Identity, The Construction of Modern National Consciousness, a revised edition in 2010, has co-edited 3 others and has published over 100 academic articles. He has written op-eds in the New York Times, Washington Post, and many other newspapers, and has appeared widely on TV and radio in the US and abroad. Rashid Khalidi, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thanks for having me.
Too many windows, that's the problem. So I'd like to sort of begin this discussion. I mean, obviously at a time like this, you've done quite a lot of interviews on what's been unfolding in Gaza more recently. And of course, it requires, to be quite analytical about what has been happening. But I sort of want to get initial impressions. Could you perhaps tell us how you, as a historian, a Palestinian American, and as a human being, how do you come to terms with what's unfolding in Gaza?
It's very hard, obviously, on the personal level. I have family in the West Bank. My brother lives in Ramallah. I have family in Jerusalem. My niece has all of her in-laws in Gaza. So we wake up every morning to make sure everyone's okay. Yesterday evening, the Israeli army went into Ramallah and arrested people, including in my brother's neighborhood. And so we were all on edge until we heard that they'd left. So it can be very difficult sometimes. I talk to relatives and friends, and we have trouble sleeping. We have strange dreams. We are obsessed with this night and day, obviously. As are, I think, many other people who have no personal family connections in Gaza or inside Palestine. It's a very disturbing set of atrocities on a global scale. We're being told that the number of killed is more than the number of killed in Syria and Iraq over multiple years of war. We're being told that the number of children who lose limbs, a dozen a day. We're being told statistics that are hard to comprehend, but are a small index of the level of atrocity and brutality and suffering that over 2 million people are enduring. And so it can be difficult. On top of that, those of us who live in the West operate in an entirely hostile media and political sphere. We're maybe supported by family, friends, communities we live in. In my case, most students and most of my colleagues are sympathetic and supportive. But the university administration is hostile. The American media are hostile. The American government is hostile. The United States corporate environment is hostile. So well, some of us are not in any particular danger or feel, that the people immediately around us are sympathetic. We know that the United States and Israel are allies in this war on the Palestinian people, and that makes it harder, obviously.
Yes, and because obviously, I mean, I think the issue, of course, is that for many, people who have connections to Palestine, Palestinians, especially those obviously who don't live in Gaza or even the West Bank, especially those who live, let's say, in the West, who have perhaps slightly, more calmer, more peaceful lives. Um, they've for a lot of them, this time is really, feels very unique and very different. Especially if you're sort of younger, you have nothing to compare this to in your terms of your own personal memory. But for someone like you who has seen so much, I mean, you were in Beirut during the 1982 siege, you've seen quite a lot. How do you feel this compares on a personal level?
I was talking about this with my wife last night, and she said, rightly, she was obviously there too. She was pregnant, in fact, during that war, the 1982 siege of Beirut. She said, this is so much worse than anything we went through. I mean, we suffered deprivation, obviously. There was a siege. There was no, water was cut off, electricity was cut off. Israelis tried to cut off food and fuel and so on. But she said, this is not only much worse, but when we were in it, it didn't feel as bad as this feels today, even though we're in complete safety. We were living through bombardment and siege and so forth. 19,000 people were killed in the Lebanese war, most of them civilians. The death toll is almost as high as in this war over a similar period of time between beginning of June and the end of the massacres of Sabra and Shatila in September. But she says this seems so much worse, even though we're at a distance and in relative safety. And I think all of us feel that way. It is worse. I mean, this is the highest Palestinian civilian death toll in the entire history of the war on Palestine. It also happens to be the highest Israeli civilian death toll in all of Israel's wars. But for us, in particular, when we're talking about so far and counting 23,000 people killed and 50 some odd thousand, close to 60,000 wounded, this is a monumental tragedy, and it's hard to get your head around it, and it's hard to come to terms with it every morning.
Yeah, it feels like this is going to be, one of the worst disasters, in Palestinian, in Palestinian history and certainly Palestinian memory. I mean, I think what's interesting is when you sort of look back on Palestinian history, you tend to think about certain events, right, as being incredibly traumatic, which obviously things like the 1948 Nakba really was very traumatic. But for those of us who weren't there at the time, it's something that's there but at the distance for many people, obviously. And now it feels like you're actually watching 1948 in real time.
Exactly. Exactly. Um, I mean, I was there in 82, and I'm having recurrent, not nightmares, but dreams and flashbacks and memories of things that happened in 82. And this, I think, is actually worse than what happened in 82. I was not alive during the Nakba, obviously, but it is bringing up historic memories of 48, of 67, of 82, of other disastrous events in Palestinian history. And I think not just for Palestinians, I think for Arabs and for people who are knowledgeable about or sympathetic to Palestine. Anyone who's read Ghassan Kanafani or Mahmoud Darwish's poems about the siege, Kanafani's books about 1948 or Palestinian refugee life, has a feeling for these things such that I think you're right. I think they do feel this is yet another recurrence of a nightmare in Palestinian consciousness.
Yes, and I think much will be written about what this moment means. But, I was saying to friends of mine, it's not just, as you say, Palestinians, I'm obviously not Palestinian, but many people around the world who are Arab, Muslim, or just people who stand in solidarity with Palestine, since the October, we feel this is something has really changed. And we can't quite put our finger on what has changed. Obviously, you have the heightened emotion going around, and this time feels more emotional than, say, the 2014 war, which, obviously people were being killed in 2014, but I don't feel like the Israelis had as much of a powerful emotional narrative for 2014 as they do for now. And I think that's part of what feels different. But I don't know, something at the very fundamental level that's kind of hard to put your finger on feels very different as well.
I think there are two things. I think the first is scale. More Palestinians have been killed in the last 3 months than ever before in the war for Palestine. In 1948, in a smaller population, obviously, as many perhaps as 15,000 people were killed. The war you mentioned, 2014, 2,100 people were killed. In Lebanon war, 19,000 people were killed. So this dwarfs any previous war, just in terms of sheer numbers. And the second thing I think you touched on is correct. This takes place in a political and media atmosphere, which is shaped by Israeli trauma, which is shaped by the reaction to a entirely sympathetic media and political structures to that Israeli trauma. What happened on the 7th of October was not just a security failure or a military defeat. It was the largest civilian death toll in Israel's history. 800 civilians were killed, the largest previous to that, going back to 1948, that is to say. And perhaps including 1948, because in 1948, 6,000 Israelis were killed. Almost all of them were soldiers. That's different. I mean, Israel obviously mourns its war dead in 73, 56, 67, and so forth. But that's different. They were soldiers. They were fighting. They were killed honorably, as it were. 800 Israelis were slaughtered, killed, murdered, however you want to put it, in 1 or 2 days. Completely unexpected what was happening to them, assuming that they were in complete security a mile or two away from one of the largest open-air prisons in modern human history. The shock and the impact of that on the media and political levels in the West is such that we've had a swing back as the atrocities have piled up on the Palestinian side, as Palestinians have been slaughtered. And there's whiplash here. We live in an environment which still privileges Israeli suffering and Israeli trauma in a situation of the greatest suffering in Palestinian history, just in numerical terms. I'm not suggesting it's worse than the Nakba of 1948. I'm just saying in terms of numbers, 2 million people have been made homeless, or nearly 2 million people. In the Nakba, 750,000 people were made homeless. In the Nakba, 15,000 people. We already are over 23,000 in Gaza. So I think there is a sense of we live in a hostile environment, politically at least. We don't actually live in a hostile environment in terms of popular sentiment, because in the United States, popular sentiment is in favor of a ceasefire. Popular sentiment is not pro-Palestinian, but it has gone quite a ways away from its almost absolute support for Israel to a much more neutral position. But on the political and the media levels, we live amongst the enemy. We live with an American government, or in your case, perhaps a British government, which are completely aligned with Israel. They cavil at this or that absolute excess on the part of the Israelis. Well, this minister shouldn't say this, which is something all Israelis are thinking. Or Israel perhaps should do less to slaughter quite so many civilians, even as it continues to do that with no restraint. But those are governments that are our enemies, in effect, are the enemies of the Palestinian people, at least, and are doing things which all of us consider to be violations of international law. So on the one hand, the media is largely favorable to Israel. The Daily Mail this morning had pictures of 4 Israeli captives, 4 young women who are prisoners, captives, hostages, kidnapped, however you want to put it, in the Gaza Strip. Now, I'd love to see the Daily Mail put pictures of 4 Palestinian children or 4 Palestinian women who are suffering in Israeli prisons, for example. That's not going to happen. So we live in that environment. We know that Israeli suffering is being privileged, that real suffering. I mean, it's not, I mean, those four people are prisoners, those four young women. They may have been soldiers, but they're still prisoners living in what must be appalling conditions. And yet we know that millions of Palestinians are living in at least equally appalling conditions, if not worse. So it makes it harder, obviously. And I think those two elements, the scale of it and the fact that we've had this sort of whiplash between an enormously emotive outpouring by all of our politicians and by the media because of Israeli suffering, combined with a distaste, coldness, absolute lack of emotion about Palestinian suffering. That monster Blinken today said, or yesterday said, I'm very, very sorry for the killing of a Jazeera journalist whose mother and sister and other members of his family had been killed. Very, very sorry. Your government probably provided the missile that killed him on purpose, together with another journalist, one of 110 journalists. You haven't said a word about Israel's targeting of journalists. If it accidentally killed 110 journalists, it should be condemned. If it intentionally killed over 200 UN workers, it should be unintentionally killed them, I should say. It should be condemned. It probably killed those people intentionally, or may have killed those people intentionally. But there's not a word from Mr. Blinken about that. But when the president talks about an American hostage who was killed, I mean, the emotion just pours out of him. So on the one hand, we have a coldness, we have an unfeeling lack of any sense of Palestinian suffering on the part of the people who are in charge of things politically and in the media. And we have a deep emotional sympathy for Israeli loss and Israeli trauma and Israeli suffering.
Yes, it's a very interesting area as well, because of course, as you said, I mean, Biden has also repeated many Israeli claims, made by Israeli officials in the media. The Shifa hospital, can't trust the casualties at the hospitals sorry, you can't trust the Gaza Ministry of Health because it's Hamas, and so they're probably lying about the figures, even though every organization international, including the State Department, treats ministerial figures from Gaza as relatively accurate. So, there's two things going on. There's Biden, and then you've obviously got his State Department, which won't openly contradict him, but you do hear a lot in the media about people in the State Department not very happy with his stances, not rebuking him, but basically by saying, they continue to use Gaza Health Ministry's figures, sort of suggesting they don't agree with him on that. And I've heard it also suggested that on a personal level, Biden is the most pro-Israel president there's been, because he just won't criticize Israel publicly on anything in this regard. Even compared
he did talk about indiscriminate bombardment, and that was walked back by his spokespersons, all of whom are manifestly hostile to the Palestinians. I mean, this man Kirby, Admiral Kirby, the hatred and the disdain and the contempt for Palestinians drips from his mouth every time he speaks. And that's the National Security Council spokesman for the White House. And I think he's the perfect face of an administration which at the top is entirely hostile to the Palestinians, doesn't see them, doesn't consider them important, whereas it cherishes and reveres and respects Israelis to the point of parroting Israeli talking points almost every time they open their mouth, from the president to Blinken to Sullivan, the national security advisor, to these monsters who are spokespersons for these leaders, like Kirby. Kirby is extraordinarily hostile. The anger and the bitterness and the disdain just drip from his face as he speaks when the Palestinians are mentioned.
Yeah, I feel this is one of the actual differences in the sense that I feel differs America from Europe in this respect, because with Europe, it always felt like their support for Israel was very transactional in the way they were getting something out of it. So depending on which country you look at, so Germany, it's, it's kind of a reparation for the Holocaust and atonement for their own history. And they see as blind supporting Israel as a way of, dealing with that to the point where they're doing some very extreme things right now. And Britain, I think, is also kind of transactional in that way as well. But with the US,
Britain has always been transactional from the Balfour Declaration to today. It was what's in it for Britain. What's in it
Yeah,
for the British Empire back in the day, and what's in it for Britain in other terms, arms sales or whatever it may be, or political contributions to politicians. It's an entirely selfish, opportunistic, narrow, transactional relationship. I don't think there's that deep sentiment that you have with many, many American politicians, both in the Republican and in the Democratic Party.
yeah, that's what I was going to get to because one thing that Americans often tell me when they're sort of talking about Israel, they said, "Listen, you have to understand there's something else at work in the US where it's not simply transactional, political, or even, because there's this idea that for many in the West, it's atonement for anti-Semitism to support Israel, at least publicly and politically. But within the US, there's something else that's going on, which is this almost at a spiritual level, this strong connection to among the political elite towards Israel, that Israel itself is a manifestation of a kind of biblical miracle, which is not something we see in the sort of European context. It's something very particular to America. And I was thinking about, connected to this, because you have serious question marks, right? So the US is obviously an imperial power in the world. It is, a takeover for many empires, the British Empire and so on. Obviously not quite the same, but it's an imperial legacy. I can't think of any other country. Maybe I'm just ignorant of history, too ignorant of history, but I can't think of any other state where you have, let's say, an empire or imperial power that is so overly committed to another state to the point where even when there's no real strategic need to support them, they just give them unquestioning support.
Yeah.
Is that something you see as well, or?
I mean, I think there is a difference between the American connection with Israel and, say, the British connection up until World War II. Whereas in the first case, the British case, as I've said, it was entirely transactional. It was a strategic calculation. When British strategy changed, they dropped the Zionists like a hot potato. They didn't care. I mean, there were committed individual Zionists like Churchill, but they saw imperial interests as far more important than their personal sympathy for Zionism. Lloyd George, Balfour, they all were committed Zionists, but they all were committed imperialists first and foremost. With the United States, there are both. I think it's much more a mix of the strategic, which I would not ignore. It's very, very important. During the Cold War, Israel was seen as a vital strategic ally. There's absolutely no question of that. During the so-called War on Terror, Sharon sold a bill of goods to a bunch of credible, naive, foolish Americans. Gaza, Hamas is ISIS, Daesh, Al-Qaeda. I mean, one of the stupidest equations in modern history. And a bunch of neoconservatives around President Bush Jr. Bought that bill of goods. And we still have that. Israeli politicians are still trying to peddle that these are Nazis, and if you don't stop them in Gaza, they'll be attacking Manhattan tomorrow. As I heard an Israeli minister mouthing those idiocies just yesterday. So that there is that strategic connection, which I would argue in the Cold War was real and is essentially fantastical today. I mean, Israel is a huge strategic liability for the United States. The United States is chained to Israel in terms of a number of things. Its policy towards Iran. Cutting a deal with Iran would and should have been much easier over its nuclear potential, over many other things, but for the obstruction of Israel. The difference, as I think you said, is that there is an emotional connection. And that is one that is a result of assiduous Israeli propaganda over generations, going right back to Woodrow Wilson, actually. Proselytization of American Protestant elites in terms of the Bible, in terms of the connection between Judaism and the Jewish people and the land of Israel, and the supposed duty of Christians to return the people of Israel to the land of Israel, which is something which incidentally motivated many British politicians to a much less important extent, however. And then you have, and that's the motivation for Christian evangelical support in the Republican Party for Israel, which is infinitely more fanatical than that of any other politicians. I mean, the people on the Republican right who are supporters of Israel are by far the most extreme people in American politics where this issue is concerned. And that's not just strategy, that's evangelical Zionism. And then you have the fact that a large number of people are connected to Israel personally. I mean, most American Jewish families have people in Israel. And Americans have grown up through Holocaust education to understand Israel as a redemption for the Holocaust, for which Americans bear some responsibility, in that the United States did not save those who could have been saved before World War II when they were allowed to leave, but no one would take them. And so there is guilt, not just in Germany, obviously, or in countries that collaborated with the Nazis in handing over their Jewish populations, like the French. The 40 or so percent of French Jews who were murdered by the Nazis were not captured by the Gestapo in their hiding places. They were captured by the French government, the Vichy government, and handed over to the Nazis to be murdered. So there's a deep guilt. They should be guilty. They are guilty. They should feel remorse, and they do. And unfortunately, that has now obviously been turned into blind support for Israel, and into a willingness to support atrocities against the Palestinian people in furtherance of their support for Israel.
So I want to sort of change the tone of the discussion a little bit, because I feel like, whenever we sort of discuss Gaza, we tend to discuss things that are happening to it that are kind of horrific. And there's a lot of things to go around about how terrible things are. As I mentioned in the intro, you've got an ongoing siege, you've had multiple wars fought on it, you've had a worsening humanitarian situation, going on for, even when these wars aren't being fought, the humanitarian situation is just getting worse and worse by the year because of various restrictions, population growth, and so on. But there's much more to the history of Gaza than all of this. Gaza has a history well before the siege. It has a history well before even this conflict. I think it's surprising to a lot of people that Gaza does actually have a long and ancient history. It's
Correct.
It's a lot big. It used to be a lot bigger than what it is. I mean, again, because when you look at Gaza on the map, it's obviously very small today, but historically the region of Gaza was a lot bigger. It was described as
Correct.
a breadbasket.
The Gaza district was much larger. That's correct.
So I wonder if you could sort of take us through briefly what is the history of Gaza in that sense.
Well, first of all, it's a very ancient place. I mean, it goes back before the Philistines to the Canaanite era, and probably before. There's a lot of prehistoric stuff. It was an important stop on the route between the Nile Valley and the Levant. Always, historically, it was important to the pharaohs. It was important to the Hittites. It was important to every people, and to every as a trading stop, and also as an oasis in a very dry region. It was always seen as lush, productive barley production. British beer was made with Gaza barley for much of the 19th century. And I say barley harvested in the Gaza region, not in the city of Gaza, obviously. It was strategically important through the Crusades. Salah ad-Din, Saladin, established some of his Mamluks there. The region Shuja'iyya is named, the neighborhood of Gaza City is named for Shuja' ad-Din, one of Saladin's Mamluks, whom he established there because of its strategic importance after the Battle of Hattin in 1187, when he took back Jerusalem from the Crusaders. So it's always been important in history as a trade route and as a strategic point, because it's right in the middle between the cities of the Levant and the cities of the Egyptian Delta. It was important in the Ottoman era, as you say. It was an important district, producing a variety of goods, and all of the descriptions of travelers describe it very favorably, right up to World War I. Now, a couple of things happened before and during World War I. The first is the imposition of a border by Britain in 1906 as a result of the Aqaba incident, which cuts Gaza off from its hinterland to the west. Now, there was movement between Egypt and what becomes later on the Palestine Mandate under British control, but that border had an impact over time. The second thing was the devastation of Gaza during World War I, because, as I've said, it's strategically important, and it was vital to the British in their push northwards into Palestine from Egypt during World War I. And the city was absolutely devastated. during World War I, bombarded within an inch of its life, much of it destroyed, and only slowly rebuilt in the 20s and the 30s. By 1948, it was again a thriving city, the center of a thriving region, the Gaza district, Qadat Ghazi in Arabic. And then it was again cut off from its hinterland by Israel's occupation of most of Palestine and its expulsion of the entire population of southern Palestine, some of them by sea, some of them into what's now the West Bank, and most of them into what becomes the Gaza Strip, the area that the Egyptian army was able to retain at the end of the 48 war. And so it then really does become cut off from its hinterland on the Palestine side by an Israeli border that gets harder and harder and harder as time goes on, culminating, as you mentioned, in the siege that begins in 2007.
Yeah, I think it's also important to highlight here as well that when the October 7th assault happened, many of the places that were entered by the various militants, including Hamas, on the so-called Israeli side of the border, most of this was part of Wadi Gaza, historically.
Right. Many of the areas that become settlements along the border with Gaza were in fact originally Palestinian villages and towns. Asdod is Ashdod. Askalan becomes Ashkelon. Bir Saba becomes Beersheba, and various villages change their names. In many cases, you can even detect the original Arabic name from the modern Israeli geographical description. So you have a population driven from the areas around Gaza into the Gaza Strip, replaced by a population of settlers who are settled along the Gaza Strip in order to contain it. Many of them are established as nahas, which say military settlements, and then become civilian settlements over time. And those are the areas that are attacked on the morning of the 7th of October and overrun, and where many people are massacred, many civilians are massacred.
Yes, and also because as we're sort of in this area, I mean, one of the things Gaza is famous for, of course, as you've sort of outlined, is its ancient history, and it's still there. I mean, or being destroyed now, but one of the big problems they were having with archaeology in Gaza was the fact that because it's 2.3 million people living in Gaza, very little room to move. I think it's like 5 miles wide, 23 miles long, or however big it is. It's very small territory, and so people have built houses and settlements over archaeological sites. There's just teething with so much, but there's still a lot there. I mean, they uncover, and there's been a long history actually of attacks on Palestinian heritage in that area. I mean, there's this really famous story, I don't know if it's true, but there's a famous story of after 1967, after Israel sort of annexed the whole area, well, took it over in the occupation, because originally, Israelis started setting up settlements and stuff in Gaza. People like Moshe Dayan, who was the famous eye-patched general that's very iconic for the founding of Israel and so on, turned up in Gaza with a shovel to sort of dig for archaeology. There's
steal artifacts to add to his personal connection. That's a tradition among Israeli archaeologists. Of that generation anyway. I mean, he and Yigal Yadin, both of them were generals in the Israeli army, became amateur archaeologists and amateur thieves.
Yeah, I think, isn't some of it now in the Israel Museum? Or
I believe some of it is, yes. I believe so.
Yeah, but now we're dealing with a different phenomenon, which is just the sheer destruction of it all. I mean, the Omari Mosque has been bombed. So much has been bombed. And
St. Theophilus Church, one of the oldest churches in Palestine, one of the oldest churches in the world, has been bombed. There are a number of similar sites. The tomb of Hashem, the uncle of the prophet, is in Gaza and has been destroyed. The Omari Mosque is one of the older mosques in Palestine, has been destroyed. The library, the Gaza Public Library, has been destroyed. The Edward Said Library, to which I donated a large number of my books, has been destroyed. The librarian has been killed. The woman who was in charge of it has been killed. So yes, there's been an enormous, I would argue, deliberate destruction of the heritage and the history and the archaeology of Gaza as part of what an anthropologist called epistemicide, destroying places, names, heritage, history, in order to drive out any memory of a pre-existing people, which is something that Israel did in renaming places all over the country, choosing biblical or fanciful names for places that had names, riverbeds, mountains, locales, sites, and so on. There's a wonderful play by Brian Friel called Translations about how Britain did the same thing in Ireland, and the parallels between Ireland and Palestine are numerous and very interesting, I think. And this is one typical example. It's about British surveyors, I think, in the 18th century, changing Irish names to British names, to English names.
Yeah, that's very interesting actually. But yeah, talk to us a bit about this policy because Israel seems to, I mean, it's not obviously something they've started doing during this war. I mean, there has been a reckless disregard for his Palestinian heritage going back way back when. We've seen, for example, in places like Jaffa and south of Tel Aviv and other places where you had, let's say, an old Ottoman mosque that's converted into a nightclub. You've had other historical architecture being destroyed. But then you
Cemeteries. Cemeteries. One of the worst examples of this is cemeteries. A cemetery in Jerusalem, several cemeteries in Jerusalem had this happen to it. The most important is Ma'man Allah, which is probably the oldest Muslim cemetery in Jerusalem, where companions of the Prophet are supposed to be buried, where mujahideen in the army of Salah ad-Din, fighters in Saladin's army are definitely buried, where generations and generations of members of Jerusalem families are buried, including many members of my own, was taken over and turned into a park, turned into a museum of tolerance, turned into a parking lot. And in some cases, the remains of people who'd been buried there were unearthed and moved to an undisclosed location. This is a typical example. They do the same in other cemeteries around, other Muslim cemeteries around Jerusalem. They're unable to do that with Christian cemeteries, and they're very solicitous, of course, of ancient Jewish cemeteries. So it's a typical example. I mean, you mentioned cases of mosques. That's been the case up and down Palestine really since 1948.
Indeed. And not just that, also when, for example, they uncover any form of ancient heritage, they sort of say, well, you see, this proves the Jewish connection to the land, when in reality, the thing they found might have been a Philistine object, might have been anything else.
I mean, you have, to their credit, you have Israeli archaeologists who fight this, but the nationalist tenor of most of Israeli archaeology dictates an obsessive focus on one very narrow period of the very varied, multi-layered history of Palestine, such that they obsessively look for what's called the First Temple period, about 1000 before the Common Era, and pretty much ignore. I mean, my colleague Nadia Abul-Hajj, in a book called Facts on the Ground, describes her own experience in a site somewhere in northern Palestine. As a, she joined the dig just to see what they did, and then wrote about it in her dissertation, which became a very important book. You could see that around the Haram al-Sharif during the excavations that Mazar and others did. There was an obsessive focus on certain strata and ignoring the other strata. In the case of Mazar, he didn't. He found and he showed what he had, and then he removed it to the immediate south of the Haram al-Sharif, what Israelis call the Temple Mount. He discovered a whole series of enormous structures which go right back to the beginning of the Umayyad period. They're 7th century, and they were built about the same time as the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. Qubbat al-Sakhra were built in the late 7th century. And what they showed was a huge what they ended up being described as was a large administrative complex, showing a deep concern on the part of the Umayyads for Jerusalem, showing the extent of their involvement in the city. And these were magnificent structures. I saw the foundations of them when I was living in Jerusalem at the time. They were just removed to go down to the next level. And only a very small part of what was discovered was ever published. So it's a typical example. I mean, you would think that the 7th century and the Muslim period, that early Muslim phase in Jerusalem's history, would be something that would merit, preservation. That wasn't the case. Other levels, Byzantine levels, or Roman levels, are often ignored in order to focus on the obsession of Israeli archaeologists, which is the heritage of this 3,000-year old period, to which they are, linked in their nationalist historiography.
Yeah, I think that's probably what's, surprising for a lot of people. I mean, of course, if we go back to the history of all of our states, they had at one point an obsession with their histories and trying to prove their histories, why we and not other groups deserve a nation. But, in other countries, that sort of faded to a large extent. It's not the centerpiece anymore. I mean, in Britain,
It's there.
It's there, but
I wouldn't ignore its importance. I mean, if you look at how Germans cherish the site in the Tannenberg forest where German tribes overwhelmed Roman legions, or if you look at how the French carefully preserve sites connected to periods in the history of the Gauls, or how in Britain the Roman ruins in Bath are preserved. This is seen. Britain is an extension of Roman Greece. Of course, we know that. So it's not unique to Israel. And Palestinians are similarly obsessed. People talk about the Jebusites and the Canaanites and the Philistines as if they're, directly connected to modern Palestine, which of course they're not. These are civilizations that existed in the same place as we describe today as Palestine. But the direct connection between them and modern Palestinian nationalism is a construction of modern Palestinian nationalism, as is the connection of modern Israel to whatever happened 3,000 years ago in what we today call Palestine.
Yeah, I wasn't meaning to suggest that there wasn't any, but it's more because one of the things I do think is slightly different is the level of obsession with it to the point where it is.
Yeah, no, you're right. That's because the claim is biblical. And so there is an obsession with the biblical period. Saw a very funny YouTube video of an Italian woman coming up to a house in Bath and telling the owner of the house, "This is my house, get out." And he says, "What?" She says, "Yes, my god Jupiter gave this to us, and Bath was a Roman city." And she shoots him, and then she says, "Anti-Jupiterite," after she shoots the man and takes over his house, making the argument that, that kind of claim from 2,500 years ago is absurd in the 21st century. But it's a claim that Israel is not the only nationalist mythology to make that kind of claim. French children were taught nos ancêtres les Gaulois for decades and decades and decades under the Third Republic. Our ancestors, the Gauls. The Gauls, German-speaking tribe, what do they have to do with 21st or 20th century France? Nothing at all. But, that's the nationalist narrative, or was.
So speaking of all of this, I feel this brings us kind of nicely to the question I want to ask, which is, what do you think, especially at a time like this, what do you think is the responsibility of a historian and a teacher during a time like this?
I think it's to talk about things that are underappreciated, to argue against false narratives, to tell the truth as best you can. And that involves, in my case, in my own writings, critiquing Palestinian leadership, critiquing Palestinian nationalist myths. But in the present situation where atrocities are being committed, describing them accurately and in terms of standards which are universal. I mean, if ethnic cleansing is a war crime, then what is being done to 2 million people in Gaza being driven out of their homes is a war crime. If, the level of killing by Israel's military is higher than the level of killing in Syria and Iraq over 2 years, then those are things that should be said. Those kinds of comparisons should be made. They should be made, unequivocally. They should be made soberly. I've been criticized by friends for drafts of things that I've written. They said, this seems bloodless. This seems, insufficiently emotional. I think it's important. If you're a historian, or if you're a scholar, or if you're a teacher, I'm not talking about in my capacity as a citizen or a political actor. I'm talking as a teacher or as a historian, to try and say things as dispassionately as possible. I honestly think that the facts in these cases that we're talking about speak for themselves. I mean, the level of atrocity that's taking place in Gaza today does not really need to be exaggerated or in any way, dressed up or it doesn't need cosmetics. What is being done is monstrous and has to be described as such. And the pretexts under which it's being done deserve to be blown to smithereens. They're completely unacceptable. To say human shields, that justifies destroying a school or a mosque? I mean, you go after your enemy, you don't go after the entire infrastructure within which your enemy is embedded. And that's something that even American generals are talking about, insofar as what they themselves did in places like Mosul and Raqqa. And I'm not suggesting that what the Americans did in those places was necessarily remained within the boundaries of the laws of war, but at least they talk about you can't use 2,000-pound bombs. You can't simply destroy a building because the enemy is in a building. You have a responsibility to risk your soldiers' lives in going after your enemy, rather than killing tens of thousands of people or thousands of people or hundreds of people in order to kill one or several of your enemies. It's simply a violation of the rules of war. And I think saying those things enough, given the wall-to-wall support for every lie that Israeli spokespersons put out, human shields and so on and so forth, in and of itself is sufficient. I don't think you need to exaggerate one bit. And I perhaps I'm overly dispassionate, but I honestly think that that's the task of an educator or the task of a historian. Politicians can do what they want. I mean, politicians can be demagogues. That's their job, perhaps. Political actors, activists, citizens. I mean, marching and using slogans. That's a different kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't think anyone listening to this interview is going to accuse you of being dispassionate. You've come across as very passionate indeed. I've got my final two questions. Perhaps this one is one you wouldn't normally ask of a historian, which is, where do you see this all going and how will this end? If you can start there.
I had absolutely no idea. We're in the middle of a war. It would be like asking, where is this war going to end in 1941 or 1942? Nobody knew before Stalingrad. Nobody knew before the Battle of Midway where World War II was going to go. I don't know where we are in this war. Maybe we're near the end. I hope and pray that we're near the end, but I don't think so. Given what Israel is saying and given the wall-to-wall cover the United States is giving to Israel to do what it pretty much wants to do, I'm afraid we're not near the end. And so to predict what will happen afterwards would be foolishness. We may be on the brink of a huge escalation if the war spills over into the Red Sea, into Lebanon, into Syria and Iraq, into Iran. Heaven forbid that any of those things happen. But they're perfectly possible right now. I mean, intentionally or unintentionally. There are Israeli leaders who want to expand the war. There are others who are not that stupid and understand that it would be a catastrophe for Israel. I don't think they care about Lebanon or anybody else, but they understand how difficult and serious and dangerous this would be for Israel. But there are others, like I would guess the prime minister, who probably gauges that his survival depends on a continuation of the war, perhaps not its expansion, but certainly its continuation. I would think that a lot of senior Israeli military officials, like the chief of staff, like the chief of military intelligence, like the head of the Southern Command, like the general in charge of the Gaza division, all of whom are responsible for one of the worst military failures in Israel's history, probably would like the war to continue, because the moment it ends, their careers are over. They're going to be subject to merciless investigations on the part of Israelis who will want to know why the army failed so badly. So the politicians and some of the generals, to their credit, have already accepted responsibility, but they will be disgraced after this war is over. And so, they have an interest, at least in its continuing, not necessarily in its expansion. So and then we have actors whose acts we can't possibly divine. The Houthis, the Iraqi militias, the Hezbollah, Hamas itself, all of these actors, Iran, all of these actors, the United States, are capable of doing things unintentionally or intentionally that could lead to a much wider war. And if that happens, all bets are off. Then we're talking about potentially, unfortunately, apocalyptic scenarios. This is bad enough, but that would be infinitely worse. The Israeli Minister of Defense today said, we have a template. The template for what we would do in Lebanon is what we're doing in Gaza. Well, that's a pretty serious threat. And I don't think that it's an idle threat. I think the Israelis intend to do that if they do go to war in Lebanon on a higher scale than they are today. So I wouldn't begin to predict. I can tell you two things. The first is that this war has produced traumatic memories, triggered, I should say, traumatic memories among Palestinians, many of their supporters and sympathizers, among Israelis, and many of their sympathizers and supporters. Each in its own way has been utterly traumatized. Israel by what happened on the 7th and its friends and supporters, and Palestinians by what has happened since the 7th. And those traumas will be with us for a long time, and they will impact political, social, and other decisions and factors for perhaps generations. I couldn't even begin to predict. I mean, after the 1973 war, which one might have expected would make Israel more hawkish, it agreed to peace with Egypt. After the first Intifada, which you might have thought would have turned Israel more hawkish, it finally agreed to negotiate with the PLO. Neither of those things led to peace in Palestine, but both of them were major changes in Israel's political course. I don't know what changes might result from this war in Israel's political course. I don't know what changes might result in Palestinian politics. Will people say armed resistance is the only path? Or will people say the destruction of Gaza should be a lesson to us? And maybe this is not I have no idea how that will go. And I think that the polling that we're seeing is completely irrelevant to how people are going to feel 9 or 12 or 18 months from today, which is what's really important. So we know what the polls say today. The Israelis are infinitely more hawkish than they were before the war, and they were pretty hawkish before the war. Palestinians are more supportive of armed struggle than they were before. And before, they were largely opposed. Today, they seem largely in favor. Will that be the case 9 months or 19 months from now? Who knows? So I wouldn't predict beyond that this will have a traumatic impact. That's the first thing. The second thing is that everything most Israelis believed about their security and about the capabilities of their military was shattered on the 7th of October. Now, the army will kill Palestinians until, in an almost unlimited fashion, in a desperate attempt to reestablish what Israelis call deterrence, which I would call terror, to terrorize the enemy to the point that the enemy will capitulate. It never worked. It will not work. I mean, it could work if you eliminated an entire population or killed half of it. I mean, some such campaigns, Grozny, Sri Lanka, have led to the complete crushing of a population and to the complete destruction of its ability to resist. I don't think that's likely to happen here. But I don't think Israelis are going to give up on that approach. So on the one hand, you have a collapse of an Israeli security doctrine and a sense of security of Israelis. And on the other hand, you have, I see no signs that among most Israelis and most Israeli politicians and strategists, there's a willingness to consider alternate approaches. Now, there are some leaders who say that now. A former prime minister has already said, stop the war. You're not going to achieve anything. Ehud Olmert has said that. And you can read in Israeli newspapers, occasionally in Yediot, more frequently in Haaretz, occasionally in Ma'ariv. You can read columnists who are saying maybe the course we're taking and have taken is not so wise. But overall, I don't see that happening. On the other hand, it may change because this is an unprecedented defeat. You know, Israel has been defeated at different stages of the 48 war, at the beginning of the 1973 war, but it always ended up winning. I don't know how victory, in the terms that the Israeli government has set for itself, is achievable in Gaza. You cannot destroy Hamas. You cannot expel the Palestinian population. Whatever goal you set is unachievable. Whatever goal they have set is unachievable. And so I'm left, it's clear that this war has created an entirely new security situation for Israelis. It's not clear to me that they would take the logical come to the logical conclusion and say we need a entirely different approach. I hope that would happen, but I'm not entirely optimistic. Or that Palestinians will overcome their divisions, or that Palestinians will resuscitate a united Palestinian national movement, or that Palestinians will finally, after more than a decade or two, more than 2 decades really, of a lack of clear strategic vision and of a blueprint, of a plan for how they plan to proceed strategically, will come up with such a plan. If those things were to happen, everything would change, irrespective of what Israel does, irrespective of what anyone else does. If the Palestinians could get their political act together, that would have an enormous impact. There would be ways in which things could be leveraged internationally and in Palestine in favor of the Palestinians that are impossible, given the divided and in many cases sclerotic and aged and incompetent and corrupt and compromised leaderships that the Palestinians suffer from in the present day.
So just a last question, and in the last like 2-3 minutes we have, I'm wondering then about the US, because we've obviously discussed the politics of the US and Biden and so on. But of course, you have students, you have people who are very engaged and very interested in this. So I'm wondering, what kind of interactions are you having with your students? What kind of things are they interested in? What direction do you see that they're going in regards to Israel-Palestine?
Well, this war has brought out something that actually was present even before this war, which is that among young people, there's been a swing in sentiment away from blind support for Israel, which was the case when I was a student many decades ago, to a larger sympathy for the Palestinians than ever before. And on those campuses where it's been measured, quite frequently votes in favor of divestment from companies that support the Israeli occupation. This campus, Columbia, Barnard campus, the Brown University campus, the University of Michigan campus, on campus after campus, large majorities have shown their sympathy for Palestine. Now that's an important shift, and that happened years ago. That didn't happen in October 2023. That happened before the pandemic, 2018, 17, 16, 19. These changes had already taken place among sentiment in major American universities, not all of them, obviously, but very many of them, including many of the elite universities. And that's a shift which the polls register among young people generally, in universities and outside of universities. Most young people in the United States oppose Biden's policies on Gaza. More young people are sympathetic to the Palestinians than they are to the Israelis. That's a huge shift by comparison with the situation even 10 or 15 years ago, let alone 50 or 100 years ago. I mean, the support for Palestine was nil at the time of Woodrow Wilson or Harry Truman. Nil. There was no support. It was not measurable. When I was an undergraduate many, many years ago, and Golda Meir came to our campus, there were 4 of us demonstrating against us, and there were hundreds of delirious students supporting Israel. Hundreds to 4. Today, the situation is entirely different among young people. So that's one indication of a major change among young people. The same kind of things is happening amongst American minorities, among African Americans, among Native Americans, among a proportion of Hispanics, among people who are immigrants from formerly colonized countries. A Jamaican friend was saying to me, well, we know what British colonialism is like. We know what they did to you and what they did to the Irish. And, they can see what, Zionists would deny, that Israel is a settler colonial project backed by a great imperial power then and now. So you have large sectors of the American population, mainly younger people, mainly minorities, including a very large number of people in the Jewish community, younger people in the Jewish community, who've shifted either to being more neutral or to being more sympathetic to the Palestinians. And you can see those numbers everywhere. I think there's still greater sympathy for Israel among Americans generally than for Palestinians. But when you ask about specific policies like Biden's policy on Gaza, overwhelming majorities of Americans are opposed to what he's doing. Huge majorities of Democrats, large majorities of independents, and even a substantial number of Republicans. They may be opposed for different reasons. So that's one reality. On the other side, the commanding heights of American politics and the economy, older people, richer people, are wall-to-wall supportive of Israel. So our universities, our foundations, our art galleries, our museums, our corporations, our politics are run by rich old people, almost all of whom are either blindly supportive of Israel or afraid to open their mouths. And that's the reality we live in. We live in a society where the richer you are, the more likely you are to support Israel, and the poorer you are, the more likely you are to be at least sympathetic to the Palestinians. And the older you are, the same obtains. And the whiter you are, the same obtains. So in Republican areas, in richer areas, in whiter areas, there's greater support for Israel. In cities like New York City, I personally feel large numbers of people here are very supportive of Palestine. And I think that's true in many American cities, in Chicago and in LA and so on. And this is true. It's a class, age, race thing. And America is a very diverse society. There are parts of it that are less diverse and parts of it that are more. It's also a society where young people have probably less influence than older people. So you see the power of the old and the rich, but the young and the less rich have a weight in this society. And many of them are much more sympathetic to Palestinians than was the case in the past. So I'm actually quite optimistic, because that's a trend that the Gaza war has accelerated, especially because of social media, because of things like podcasts. People have utter contempt for the mainstream legacy corporate media. They know that they are lying, that they are deeply biased, that they're run by people who are entirely sympathetic to Israel in this case, or to the war in Ukraine, or whatever it may be. And they have contempt for the mainstream media. They pay no attention to it. They get their news from other sources. And those may be good sources or bad sources, whereas the mainstream media are all bad. I mean, there's nothing good in the mainstream media. Even the better articles are, in a paper like the Washington Post or the New York Times, are embedded in a sea of hostile propaganda for Israel. The occasional show on CNN, which is even-handed or fair, is embedded in a sea of basically Israeli propaganda. And young people know that. People who depend on social media know that. A, and B, they have other sources. And so, what's his name? Azzeddin Alayla, I think his name is. I don't get his name right. He has 18 million followers on Instagram. That's more followers than Joe Biden has. That's more than the entire viewership of Fox and MSNBC and CNN, the three major cable channels. That's where people are getting, young people at least, are getting their news. And that's a welcome change. I mean, a lot of what's on social media, of course, is rubbish. Much of it is false. There's a huge amount of disinformation. But at least the younger people I know are very discerning. They know how to strain the wheat from the chaff. And that's a big factor in the shift. If you see what is actually happening in Gaza, you cannot have the same views as someone whose view is restricted to the lying, biased propaganda put out by the mainstream media. You can't have the same view of it. You see the butchery. You see the attacks on civilians. You see journalists being targeted. You see 200 plus UN officials, the largest death toll in the United Nations' entire history. My father worked for the UN for his whole career. My brother worked for the UN for his whole career. Never in the history of the United Nations has so many of its employees been killed. That's something that people know from social media. Do you think that the New York Times ever reports that sort of thing? It doesn't. It doesn't. There are 110 journalists who've been killed in Gaza. Does the New York Times report that regularly? No. It mentioned it in the bottom paragraph of an article that was mainly about Israel Today. You had to read 12, 14, 18 paragraphs to get to that. But people who are following the news through social media and other means have access to those kinds of things. So I think that I personally feel that, I live in an environment that's not entirely hostile. I mean, the people who work in the building I live in, the people who run the buses, the people who I encounter in the street. A friend of mine was walking from a demonstration with a keffiyeh. Two policemen come towards him. He said to himself, "Oh boy, I'm in trouble." The cops come close to him. One of them says, "Free Palestine," and keeps walking. Well, that's ordinary American working people. By and large, no, there are many of them who are supportive of Israel and hostile to the Palestinians, but there are many of them who are not. That's new in American society. That's something of the last decade or 15, 20 years at most. And it's a source of optimism for me.
Yeah, it's kind of funny that story you just told because something similar happened in the UK where a guy was walking around with a kafir on his and a police car pulls up next to him and they call him over and he thinks he's going to be like arrested or something, and then the police officer just goes free Palestine and drives off. So
that's exactly what happened to my friend at Union Square, 14th Street, a month and a half ago. That's very strange. In Britain.
In London.
Well, it's actually not strange. I mean, where do the police draw their recruits? Among, a broad cross-section of the population. And a broad cross-section of the population is in favor of a ceasefire in the United States. The polls are unequivocal. People oppose Biden's policy on Palestine. Majorities. Republicans, Democrats, Independents. The president may well lose this election anyway, but a factor in his likely defeat is his support for Palestine in places like Michigan and New Jersey and Illinois and Pennsylvania, where there are a large number of Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, young members of the Jewish community who are completely alienated, and other young people and minorities who are completely alienated from Biden for a variety of reasons, one of which is his support for genocide in Gaza.
Rashid Khalidi, thank you for talking to us at Memo Conversations.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
To our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you'd like to watch this or catch up with previous Memo Conversations, you can go to our website. But for now, goodbye and hope to see you next week.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.